An ordinary barista, an extraordinary dream. When Ryan Reynolds walks into the coffee shop, he notices not just the perfect latte but the talent hidden behind the counter. Ethan, caught between espresso and Shakespeare, gets a chance he was afraid to even dream of. But a first audition failure threatens to bury his ambitions forever. A broken cup, a cassette with a raspy laugh, and lessons from Deadpool. What does it take to rewrite your own story? When the world expects your downfall, how do you find the strength to deliver the final monologue? A Brooklyn morning began with a false note. The clatter of a garbage truck churning the alley's stomach, the screech of brakes on Hooper Street, the chatter of sparrows mimicking car alarms. Through the fogged glass of lavender espresso, the world looked like a watercolor stain. Blurred silhouettes of caps, a yellow taxi stuck in an eternal left turn, a girl in an oversized Princeton sweater reading Borges by a tram pole. Behind the counter, Ethan wiped a mug with the meticulousness of a monk transcribing psalms. His hands moved unconsciously, 3 wipes to the right, 2 to the left, pausing to check the gleam on the ceramic. On his left wrist, a tattoo glinted. All the world's a stage, in cursive mimicking Shakespeare's handwriting from his will. His right sleeve hid the continuation. But the play is dreadfully soggy, added a year later in blue ink at an underground parlor on Atlantic Avenue. The espresso machine hissed like a worn-out horse. Every 7 minutes, Ethan caught himself counting time. 58 seconds for a double shot, 12 for frothing milk, 30 for the design. Rose, tulip, heart, rose again. Latte art was his magic circle. While his fingers traced patterns in the foam, his mind rehearsed monologues. This morning, between layers of oat milk and caramel syrup, he ran through a scene from Hamlet, where the ghost appears on the castle battlements. The customer with the iced coffee received not just coffee, but Hamlet trembling before his father's ghost, whose whisper merged with the hiss of steam from the espresso machine. In the corner, at a table with a crack shaped like the Great Lakes, a regular customer, a gray-haired man in glasses with thick lenses, rewrote the first paragraph of his novel for the 100th time. A balsamic vinegar stain on a napkin nearby resembled an archipelago map. Ethan knew them all. The woman who ordered a cappuccino, exactly 145 degrees. The student flutist who left sheet music instead of tips. The old man arguing with a voice in his Bluetooth headset. They were the chorus in his personal tragedy titled 28 Years, 3 Failed Editions, 8,000 Lattes. Ryan Reynolds entered as if the door itself stepped aside for him. No jingle of the bell, no creak of hinges. He wasn't in Deadpool's red suit, but in a sweater the color of faded jeans. The hood pulled over his unshaven stubble. A shadow from the curtain fell across his face like a scar, but his eyes gave him away immediately. That specific shade of blue, like aquamarine mixed with irony. Ethan froze with the milk pitcher in hand. A thought flashed with the clarity of a subtitle. If I drop this now, the story will be a meme by lunch. His fingers instinctively gripped the handle. Years of training had turned his body into a slave to ritual. Almond milk, Ryan said, studying the menu written in chalk in the style of a madman's diary, with arrows, smileys, and random Kafka quotes. Is that the stuff that makes people cry on TikTok because it reminds them of existential emptiness? His voice was deeper than in the movies, with a slight rasp, as if he had just stepped out of a smoke-filled club in Deadpool. Ethan felt the Shakespearean line on his wrist pulse as if alive. The preparation process became a surreal dance. His hands did their job, while his mind oscillated between panic and professional pride. Don't look at his lips. Don't remember the scene from The Proposal, where he kisses Sandra Bullock. Oh God. He smells like coffee and something expensive, like a forest after rain in a boutique perfumery. When Ryan took the cup, their fingers almost touched. Ethan noticed the trace of a wedding ring and a scratch on his knuckle, maybe from filming, or perhaps from trying to open an Amazon package at 3 a.m. You're like a theater ghost, Ryan remarked, nodding at the tattoo as the coffee flowed down his throat. Just don't start singing under my balcony at 2 a.m. The joke hung in the air, mingling with the aroma of freshly ground beans. Ethan forced the corners of his lips to lift, a standard reaction to tips in the form of wit. But inside, something clicked, like the lock of a safe holding long-forgotten ambitions. Ryan left, trailing a sense of unfinished business and $1 in the tip jar labeled, "Tips turn baristas into philosophers." Ethan found himself wiping an already clean counter, his eyes automatically searching the crowd for a hood the color of faded jeans. Outside, an ambulance siren wailed, a typical Brooklyn sound, but today it reminded him of a theater bell signaling the start of the second act. By evening, as the sun spread across the brick walls like spilled caramel syrup, Ethan found a crumpled napkin under the chipped cup, the one for unlucky customers. On it, someone had drawn a stick figure with a sword and the caption, "To be or to latte, that is the question." He hid the napkin behind the cassette of Ethiopian Sidamo beans, where old off-Broadway show tickets lay. The coffee grinder word, signaling the start of the evening rush, a time when dreams are temporarily wrapped in baking foil to keep from burning. But somewhere between an order of soy ristretto and a vegan croissant, Ethan suddenly realized, today's espresso for Reynolds had taken 7 seconds longer than usual. And that was the first unintentional deviation from the script in 1,214 days. Brooklyn didn't sleep. It tossed in the fever of lights, sighed with the exhaust of trucks, and coughed with the muffled thuds of the subway beneath the asphalt. At Lavender Espresso, the scent wasn't of coffee but of the third act of a play, a mix of fatigue, late-night epiphanies, and cinnamon, which Ethan generously sprinkled into cups after midnight. Beyond the glass, silhouettes loomed. A courier on an electric bike with a face frozen in a grimace of eternal time pressure. A couple kissing under a streetlight as if their lips were trying to erase each other into graphite dust. A homeless man declaiming Nietzsche to the trash cans. Ethan was rearranging chairs upside down, their legs sticking out like the masts of ships wrecked on the shore of linoleum. His t-shirt was soaked between his shoulder blades, a stain in the shape of Australia, slowly spreading to his lower back. In his pocket, a crumpled theater program burned, a performance he missed due to the evening shift. On the cover, an actor smiled with the face of a quintessential Disney prince, the kind Ethan left sarcastic comments about in theater groups at 5 in the morning. The creak of the door made him jump. Ryan Reynolds entered, this time without a hood, his hair tousled by the wind from the East River. He carried a script, a stack of pages bound with a hair tie, with notes in the margins resembling a cardiogram. "Double espresso," he said, not even glancing at the menu, and Ethan realized this had become a ritual. A star ordering coffee from a failed barista, like in a bad musical about New York. His hand automatically reached for the coffee grinder, fingers feeling the roughness of beans, still holding the heat of the Ethiopian sun. As the machine spat out black liquid into a tiny cup, Ethan felt the edge of his own script in his apron digging into his ribs. He hadn't noticed the yellowed corners of Hamlet, peeking out from under the fabric, as if spying on the scene. Ryan looked up. His eyes slid over the Shakespearean tattoo, lingered on the protruding corner of the script, then slowly rose to Ethan's face. The gaze was not from the movies, without the protective layer of sarcasm, raw and sharp like a razor blade in the shaving scene from Schindler's List. Ethan cleared his throat, adjusting his apron to hide the telltale sheet. But the movement gave him away. His finger trembled, and the script slipped out, falling onto the counter with a dull thud. Between them lay a pause, thick as unwhipped milk. Ryan picked up the script. His fingers, familiar to the world from millions of Deadpool memes, flipped through the pages with unexpected gentleness. Ethan's margins were filled with notes. Too loud? Cry here? Why doesn't he answer the letters? Next to Ophelia's line, someone had drawn a smiley face with an axe in its head. Off Broadway? Ryan asked, not looking up. His voice sounded muffled, as if they both found themselves inside an old film reel. Ethan nodded, suddenly realizing his throat was as dry as a desert in a beer commercial. He tried to imagine how many times Reynolds had seen such scripts, in the hands of waitresses dreaming of an Oscar, Uber drivers quoting Stanislavski between rides. But instead of mockery, Ryan pulled out a pen. On the title page, over the character's name, he wrote, "Try playing this as if Hamlet works as a barista. $3 for a cappuccino, $5 for an existential crisis. Laughter escaped Ethan unexpectedly, raspy, long and used, like the creak of an unoiled door. Ryan smiled with the corner of his mouth, as if checking off an invisible checklist. When he left, leaving a crumpled check with an autograph instead of a tip, for tax purposes. Reynolds, acting consultation, $0. Ethan found himself trembling, not from excitement but from something more dangerous, recognition. The feeling when someone sees not your role, but the crack in your makeup. The night stretched like a caramel thread between a pitcher and a cup. At 3 a.m, when even the rats in the alley stopped rummaging through the trash, Ethan barricaded himself in the storeroom. Among bags of beans and stacks of paper cups, he stood in a pose he had once practiced in Meisner classes. The script clung to his palms. To be or not to be sounded different when the dishwasher hummed behind the wall, and instead of Elsinore Castle, there were shelves of amaretto syrup. He stumbled over words, his voice breaking on high notes, but suddenly, on the phrase "life is a garden where only weeds grow," something clicked. Maybe it was the sound of a broken coffee grinder, or maybe an old lock in his soul, long rusted from disuse. In the morning, wiping down the counter, Ethan found himself drawing abstract figures in the foam, something between Icarus's wings and a broken cup. The first customer, a hedge fund manager with eyes like empty Excel spreadsheets, blinked at his latte. "Is this a new thing?" he asked, pointing at the foam. "An experiment," Ethan replied, for the first time in years not apologizing. By noon, photos with the hashtag #modernartcoffee appeared on Instagram. By evening, a line stretched to the corner laundromat. And at 2 a.m, as he closed up, Ethan found a package on the doorstep. Inside was a worn book, Respect for Acting by Uta Hagen, with notes in the margins. On the end paper was an inscription, "From Deadpool to Hamlet, the next round is yours." He sat on the steps, clutching the book to his chest. Somewhere, a siren wailed, but now it sounded like an orchestra tuning up before a premiere. In his apron pocket waited a crumpled sheet, an audition invitation he had been afraid to look at for 3 weeks. The espresso machine sighed with steam. Something tickled in his throat from laughter. For the first time in 1,215 days, Ethan allowed himself to imagine what it would be like not to count the seconds of frothing milk. Brooklyn rain tapped on the awnings of lavender espresso in Morse code, which only those who had listened to the city's whispers through the subway noise for years could decipher. The damp air was filled with the aroma of croissants with truffle butter and unspoken lines. Ethan circled behind the counter like a marionette whose strings were tangled between cups and doubts. His apron was adorned with a new stain in the shape of Madagascar, and in his pocket burned a business card from a theatrical agent, found in the pages of Uta Hagen's book between the chapters Improvisation and Fear of Emptiness. Ryan now appeared regularly, always at different times, as if checking how deeply the coffee routine had seeped into Ethan's skin. Today he sat by the window, which had turned into an aquarium with blurred silhouettes of passers-by, scribbling something in a notebook with a cover the color of old film reels. His left leg involuntarily tapped a rhythm, a strange mix of rock and roll and military march. Ethan watched out of the corner of his eye as he prepared a matcha latte for a girl with blue hair and a nose piercing. His hands automatically performed the movements. 70 degrees Celsius, 3 breaths before frothing, a spiral of matcha powder over the milk foam. But his mind clung to Ryan, to how his fingers gripped the pen, too tightly for mere notes, as if he were carving words out of the paper's flesh. When the line dissolved like sugar in a melted iced Americano, Ryan stood up. Instead of his usual joke, he placed an audio cassette in a clear case on the counter. The label read, "Deadpool's Hangover Mix," with a drawing of a unicorn vomiting a rainbow. For the time machine, he snapped his fingers, pointing to the old cassette player under the tea shelf. Track number 3 is particularly inspiring for heroics. The cassette felt warmer in his palm than it should have. Ethan expected mockery, a trick, but Ryan had already disappeared into the rainy haze, leaving a trail of broken droplets. Night found Ethan in the storeroom, where the light flickered like a bad theater spotlight. The cassette crackled in the 90s tape player, smelling of dust and nostalgia. After the hiss and crackle, a voice flowed out, not Ryan's, but his own, recorded on a hidden recorder. It was the very monologue from the storeroom, where Hamlet argued with a ghost between syrup boxes. Ethan listened as his own voice broke on the word corpse, as the dishwasher joined in a duet at the climax. Then, silence, the creak of a chair, and suddenly another voice. Ryan, speaking through the door. Too much technique, not enough blood. They need to see your capillaries bursting with truth. Ethan dropped the headphones. His heart beat in time with the cassette's crackle. He hit rewind, again and again, until the words were imprinted in his memory. Blood, truth, bursting. On the back of the cassette was a note. P.S. If you burn this, I'll send a version with your falsetto at 2:15. Morning brought sunshine and tourists with secrets of Brooklyn maps to the coffee shop. Ethan made coffee, feeling the cassette in his pocket like contraband. Suddenly, his hands began to tremble. Not from fatigue, but from the realization that someone had seen his soul laid bare. He spilled espresso, and a drop fell on the open page of Hamlet, spreading into a blot over the line words, words, words. Ryan arrived at noon, carrying an old projector under his arm. Without a word, he set up the screen on the wall where the duty roster usually hung. Employees and customers froze, watching as the beam of light cut through the dust, revealing fragments of a black and white film. A young actor with Reynolds' face performing in a school play. He forgot his lines, laughed at his mistakes, then suddenly froze, delivering a monologue so powerfully that the camera shook. When the film ended, Ryan pulled a metronome from his pocket. 20 years ago, he said, placing it on the counter. Now it ticks faster. Ethan understood without explanation. He stood behind the counter, turned on the metronome, and began preparing a cappuccino to its ticking. Steam from the milk frother pulsed in time. Milk foamed at 120 beats per minute. When he placed the cup in front of Ryan, the foam trembled in even waves. Too perfect, Ryan nudged the cup, and the foam spread into an asymmetrical island. Life is jazz, and you're still playing scales. By evening, when the metronome was put away and the projector folded into a corner, Ethan found a marker trace on the screen, an arrow pointing to a crack in the wall. Next to it was written, Entrance to the Underworld. Ticket 1 failure. That night, he stood before the mirror in the storeroom, rehearsing the monologue under the emergency light. This time without a script. The words flowed like molten wax, burning and taking shape on the fly. When he shouted the final line, a box of straws fell somewhere, applauding with rustling plastic. In the morning, the first customer received a cappuccino with foam in the shape of an abstract scream. The girl with blue hair filmed it for TikTok with the hashtag existential foam. Ryan didn't show up for 3 days. On the fourth dawn, Ethan found an envelope at the door. Inside was an audition ticket tied with a broccoli rubber band, a nod to their first conversation about existential almond milk. On the back was a stamp, official invitation to chaos. Dress code, blood on sleeves. When he looked up, a figure in a hood the color of faded jeans flashed across the street. The figure waved, mimicking a gun, and dissolved into the crowd, leaving a trail of laughter that could have been real or an echo in his head. The espresso machine hissed with renewed force, spitting steam in time with his heart. The agent's business card burned in his pocket like a coal, and the tattoo on his wrist pulsed with new meaning. All the world's a stage, but now you know where the hidden exit is. The theater lobby smelled of old chairs and unfulfilled ambitions. Ethan stood by the wall adorned with posters of forgotten productions, where the actors' names had faded more than the titles. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of a jacket bought at a thrift store the day before. The fabric smelled of mothballs and someone else's triumphs. In his pocket waited a bookmark from Uta Hagen's book with the quote, "Fear is just excitement without the courage to come out into the light." The audition room was smaller than he had imagined. A room with depression-colored linoleum, 3 chairs behind an IKEA table, and a window through which light filtered, sliced by the fire escape grate. The committee members resembled a triptych: a woman with gray hair braided into a snake-like plait on the left, a man counting calories in a notebook on the right, and a young man in glasses in the center, his gaze scrolling over an iPad screen like an endless TikTok feed. Ethan exhaled the character's name, but the air turned into an icy needle stuck in his throat. His voice sounded like someone else's recording, flat, technical, lifeless. His hands, usually so confident with a milk pitcher, gestured mechanically, tracing geometry of despair in the air. He saw the woman on the left start knitting something from khaki-colored yarn, the man on the right check a box next to energy 2 out of 10, and the young man in the center yawn, covering his mouth with his knuckles. The monologue ended sooner than it should have. Silence filled the room like thick syrup. Ethan stepped back, treading on the shadow of a chair. It hissed like a hot skillet. "Thank you, we'll call you," the woman said without looking up from her knitting needles. The phrase sounded like an epitaph. Outside, Ethan tossed the jacket into a trash can, where it hung on the edge, as if hesitating to join the scraps. Rain, starting suddenly, trickled down his collar, mixing with the sweat on his spine. He walked past storefronts where his reflection shattered into 100 Ethans, each grimacing in silent mockery. At Lavender Espresso, the emergency light was on. Ethan barged in, not noticing the key scratching the lock. The coffee machine greeted him with a hiss like a wounded beast. He made an espresso, ground 3 times, bitter as bile, and downed it, feeling the liquid burn his esophagus. The phone buzzed in his pocket. An unknown number. Ryan's assistant's voice sounded like it was coming from a tunnel. "Mr. Reynolds asked me to tell you." Ethan threw the phone onto the counter, where it slid into a puddle of spilled milk. Dawn found him drafting a resignation letter. The letters danced on the screen, merging into a pattern reminiscent of chains. Suddenly, the door slammed behind him. Ryan entered, carrying a box of donuts dusted with powdered sugar like crematorium ashes. He sat at the table with the crack shaped like the Great Lakes, arranged the donuts in a line, and began methodically biting into each one without swallowing. Ethan watched as crumbs fell onto Uta Hagen's book, open to the chapter, How to Survive Failure. "In '98, I played tree number 2 in a toilet paper commercial," Ryan said, wiping his fingers on a page with a photo of Marlon Brando. "The director yelled that I was too anthropomorphic for Flora." Ethan wanted to laugh but made a sound like a bursting balloon. Ryan held up a tiny piece of glaze, examining it like an artifact. "After the 27th rejection for Deadpool, I watched Green Lantern on repeat for 3 days. Cried. Then I realized they weren't afraid of me, but of what I reminded them of, their own unspoken fears." The coffee machine roared, spitting steam. Ryan stood up, leaving a donut with a single bite mark, a perfect crescent. "Tomorrow at 7, he said, already at the door. "Bring your most broken cup." Ethan waited for the last beat of the metronome hanging over the counter. At 7 in the morning, he carried a black cup with a crack, where bitterness from over-roasted beans had seeped for decades, into the courtyard. Ryan waited with a hammer in hand. The tool gleamed like a surgical scalpel. The strike was swift. The porcelain shattered into shards, each catching a ray of the rising sun. Ethan screamed, not from fear, but from catharsis, as Ryan crushed the fragments into dust, mixing it with last year's leaves. "Now put it back together," Ryan said, handing him a tube of super glue. "But don't try to hide the cracks." By noon, the cup stood on the counter, glued into a whimsical collage of voids and scars. Customers poked at it, asking if it was the Japanese kintsugi technique. Ethan shrugged, pouring coffee so the liquid streamed through the cracks, creating patterns more unpredictable than any latte art. In the evening, a box appeared at the doorstep. Inside were clown shoes the size of boats and a note. "For the second act, we'll fall in style." When Ethan looked up, across the street, a screen glowed with an ad for Ryan's new movie. The hero in the Deadpool costume flipped the bird, but the eyes behind the mask laughed. The same laughter that echoed in the storeroom over the shattered cup. The espresso machine sighed, releasing a cloud of steam that briefly took the shape of applause. In his apron pocket, the phone came to life, showing a notification for a new audition. This time, Ethan kept the jacket, not as armor, but as a reminder that even ruins can be a foundation. The theater greeted Ethan with the smell of fresh paint. Someone had patched the cracks in the walls, but they showed through the plaster like scars under concealer. In his pocket lay the mended cup, wrapped in a coffee-stained cloth, its jagged edges digging into his thigh with each step. On the stage, where his hopes had crumbled a week ago, now stood 3 chairs draped in black fabric reminiscent of raven wings. Ethan walked past the mirror in the dressing room without looking at his reflection. The guy in the perfectly pressed shirt was a stranger. Instead, he took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, revealing his tattoos. On his wrist, over the Shakespearean quote, was a fresh design, a crack mirroring the pattern of the broken cup. In the audition room sat the same 3 people: the woman with the snake-like braid, the man with the calorie-counting notebook, and the young man scrolling through TikTok. But today, their table was adorned with the coffee cup, the very one mended with super glue and fury. Ethan placed a bag of coffee beans on the floor, taking out Ryan's old metronome. The mechanism began ticking, slower than his heartbeat. He turned it on, closed his eyes, and suddenly the room filled with the sounds of lavender espresso. The hiss of steam, the jingle of the bell above the door, the creak of a regular customer's chair with his unfinished novel. The monologue began on its own. Words burst forth not from memory, but from the burns on his tongue from too hot espresso. Hands accustomed to measuring milliliters broke invisible chains. His foot, unconsciously tapping Ryan's march rhythm, beat a tattoo on the floor where the heels of Hamlets and Lears had once trod. The woman with the braid dropped her knitting needles. The man stopped counting calories, drawing a line through his entire notebook. The young man dropped his iPad, its screen cracking to mirror the pattern on the cup. When the final word dissolved into silence, Ethan pulled a packet of cinnamon from his pocket. He tossed a pinch into the air. The spice mixed with the dust from the spotlights, creating a mirage of the coffee shop amidst the theatrical void. "Thank you," the woman whispered, picking up her needles with trembling hands. This time it sounded like a beginning, not an end. Outside, Ethan sat on the fire escape, feeling the adrenaline drain from his fingertips. His phone rang in his pocket, a number with a 212 area code. He didn't answer, knowing that any word now would shatter the fragile moment like a clumsy movement ruins latte art. Returning to lavender espresso, he found a box on the counter. Inside lay a red clown nose and a note. "For the intermission, now you know how to fall upward." That night, after the last customer left, kissing the waitress with blue hair, Ethan played Ryan's cassette. From the speakers flowed a recording of his monologue from today, overlaid with applause from the film Birdman. On the other side of the cassette was a new inscription: "PPS. If they don't take you, we'll put on the show in the storeroom. Tickets, 2 coffee beans." In the morning, preparing a cappuccino for a policeman with eyes like deflated tires, Ethan noticed the young man from the committee in line. He ordered an espresso, but when he received the cup, he flipped it over. Coffee spilled onto the table, tracing the contours of a map of Brooklyn. "The director wants to meet," the young man muttered, wiping the spill with a napkin bearing the theater's logo. "Says you're unconventional." Ethan handed him a new cup, with a crack filled with golden resin. "Tell him that conventional is just fear of emptiness in the foam." When the theater courier left, Ethan looked at the metronome. The needle had stopped at 66 beats, Shakespeare's age at death. In the window, he saw a figure in a leather jacket waving with a Deadpool gloved hand. But when he turned around, there was only an old lady with a cart, humming an aria from Carmen. That evening, while closing up, he found an envelope with a wax seal on the doorstep. Inside lay a contract, smelling of grease paint and old backstage, and underneath it, a photo of Ryan as tree number 2. On the back was a signature: "P.S. Now it's your turn to scare directors with anthropomorphism." The espresso machine howled in time with his laughter. For the first time in 1,216 days, Ethan didn't count the seconds it took to froth the milk. The foam rose unevenly, bubbling like champagne in a cheap glass, and was more beautiful than any tulip or rose. The Brooklyn morning poured into the windows of lavender espresso, like liquid gold, tinting the walls in shades of old film reels. Behind the counter whirled a new barista, a girl with pink hair and a break-a-leg tattoo on her collarbone, whose hands traced hearts in the foam with mathematical precision. Ethan watched from the corner where the gray-haired writer used to sit, now swapping his novel for memoirs. His fingers absently fiddled with a coffee bean hidden in his coat pocket, a talisman from his first audition. Theater posters bearing his name hung 3 blocks away, but here, amid the scent of over-roasted Arabica, he was still the guy who mixed up orders while rehearsing Shakespeare. The cup with gilded cracks stood on the shelf behind the counter, now a local relic next to a photo of Ryan flipping off the coffee. The girl behind the counter started dropping a pitcher. Milk spilled across the countertop, tracing the contours of Australia, the same stain that once adorned Ethan's apron. He stood up, walked over, and took a cloth without a word. Their hands met over the spill, and Ethan noticed a corner of a script peeking from under her sleeve. "Sorry," she mumbled, hiding the sheet deeper. "It's just for friends." He nodded, wiping the milk in circular motions as Ryan had once taught him. For a moment, the air thickened with memories. The scent of the broken cup, the ticking of the metronome, the cassette with Ryan's raspy voice in the storeroom. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from his agent about a screening in Los Angeles. Ethan silenced it, watching as the girl tried to draw a tulip, but the foam spread into an abstraction. Her shoulders tensed, fingers gripping the pitcher like a grenade without a pin. He took a worn copy of Uta Hagen's book from his bag and placed it next to the vanilla syrup. The girl glanced at it, her eyes widening as she recognized the cover. "Is this you?" she asked, pointing to the notes in the margins where Ryan had once drawn caricatures of producers. Ethan smiled, adjusting the cracked cup. On the bottom, where no one looked, was an inscription. "Next round's on you. RR." Customers came and went, leaving traces of conversations. An elderly teacher quoting King Lear ordered a latte with cinnamon. The foam was adorned with a crown of nutmeg. A flutist student, now with gray at his temples, left sheet music instead of a tip, a melody titled Ode to Espresso. By evening, as the sun turned the windows into stained glass, Ethan was alone. The girl had left, stuffing the script into her bag as if hiding contraband. He approached the counter, took a clean napkin, and dipped a pen in cold coffee. The ink lay unevenly, mimicking Ryan's handwriting. "Ever tried not acting?" He placed the napkin under her apron, where he once kept tickets to canceled performances. The coffee grinder roared, spitting out the last beans of the day. The door creaked open. A teenager in a Deadpool cap stood there, his face filled with the same shy defiance that once burned in Ethan's own reflection. Ethan poured an espresso without asking. Steam rose in a spiral, briefly taking the shape of Deadpool's mask. The teenager took the cup, their fingers not touching, but something clicked in the air, like the day the door first opened for Ryan. Outside, neon signs lit up. Somewhere, a saxophone played, blending with the roar of motorcycles. Ethan stepped out, leaving the door ajar. In his pocket, the coffee bean jingled, and the tattooed crack on his wrist pulsed in time with his steps. He walked past the theater where his name now shone next to a review quote, "Played a broken cup so well it made you want to mend your own." In a store window, a screen glowed with an interview featuring Ryan, talking about a newcomer who makes coffee cooler than my jokes. At home, amid stacks of scripts and dried latte art, Ethan found an old cassette. He inserted it into the tape player, hearing laughter. His and Ryan's blended into one sound. In the background, the coffee machine hissed, beating the rhythm of applause. In the morning, he returned to lavender espresso. The girl with pink hair made coffee, and under her apron glowed the napkin with his message. A new customer by the window with the face of a weary angel read a script, marking the margins with exclamation points. Ethan sat at the table with the crack lakes, ordering an espresso. When the cup was placed before him, he recognized the handwriting. The foam depicted a smiley face with a sword. Turning the cup, he found a new inscription on the bottom. Chapter 2. Write it yourself.
Erbe.
The sun rose higher, melting the shadows into syrup. Somewhere in the city, a girl pulled out a script, brushing crumbs from the first page. Somewhere, a teenager in a cap rehearsed a monologue in front of a mirror in the storeroom. And in Lavender Espresso, Ryan Reynolds finished his coffee, knowing that the finale is just a pause before someone enters the door again.